mathematically calculate optimal policies, not only for themselves, but also for other agents in the economy. And so this is all kind of too demanding on typical households and firms. I'll come back to this point later. So we have these two extremes. Here, you know everything, kind of a superhuman. Here, you know very little, which is also clearly unrealistic. You can't fool all people at all times. So something has to be in the middle. And over the years, there has been a lot of effort to come up with a more realistic framework, which has, you know, some realistic elements from this part and also some, you know, appeal from this part. And roughly, you can have two groups of kind of research directions here. One is you preserve rationality, but you allow for imperfect information. This is this block of models. Or you abandon rationality, but you allow people to know what is happening in the economy. Now, there is still much debate about, you know, where we should be here, or maybe we need an entirely different model. But there is a lot of work along these lines, and so this is why I think we have made a lot of progress since 1950s, and all those quotes from central bankers, you know, are fair to some extent, but not completely. Now, let me focus a little bit on more on this subject here, because this is really the key macroeconomic framework now, and we have to understand the pros and cons of using this for policy research and so on. Now, it came from this, you know, famous paper by Muth in 1961, but at the time it was a relatively obscure paper. Most people didn't know about this. It only many years later, when Robert Lucas kind of popularized this idea and said, look, you can go really far with this full information rational expectations. It became really an appealing framework for many macroeconomists. And, you know, if you look at kind of various metrics of success of this, for example, how many FIRE-based models are used by central bankers, and you will see that almost every single central bank in advanced emerging economies is using a model based on full information rational expectations. So it's really a testament of success of this framework. It's really appealing in the sense that it imposes a lot of discipline on models, and it forces us to think about short run, long run, and how people form expectations. Now, we can also see this in kind of the evolution of how we think about the Phillips curve. You know, here we had this adaptive expectations, here we have FIRE, and, you know, this is really the key building block of many macroeconomic models now. So, you know, people were talking about the death of the Phillips curve until recently. Now it seems the Phillips curve is alive and well. And, you know, it's consistent with many elements developed here in this earlier work. Now, one key element in this framework is that expectations are there, the key ingredient, but obviously expectations are an endogenous variable. It doesn't necessarily have, they don't necessarily have independent variation. And, you know, in fact, you don't really need this, you know, measurement of expectations, because they have to be model consistent. So if you have a model, that's all you need to know about expectations. You don't need to ask people about what they think about inflation or output or unemployment. And this led, you know, some people to conclude that, you know, we don't really need a measurement of inflation expectations. I'll come back to this in a moment. In any case, this, you know, FIRE-based macro is really the dominant framework now. Now, the key sort of assumption in full information rational expectations is that, you know, this is how people are behaving. This is how they form expectations. And, you know, in theory, we can test predictions of this framework. We can ask people about their inflation expectations, unemployment expectations, output expectations, pricing expectations. And there is a lot of work along this line. So I'm not going to do a full summary of what was done over the years. But in short, we see that, you know, people are behaving rationally in the long run. So eventually people figure out what's the optimal set of policies they should follow in response to the shocks they observe. But when you focus on the short run or even medium run, you see pervasive deviations from FIRE in survey data. So people don't know everything about the shocks. They don't have the best predictions. Uh, massive departures from full information rational expectations. Now, this evidence was not entirely convincing for again mainstream macroeconomists for quite some time, and kind of the logic of this was summarized by Ed Prescott many years ago, basically saying you can't really measure expectations. It's like utility, and so we shouldn't even try to do anything with surveys or anything like this, because whatever people tell you, this is just useless garbage. Now, this was kind of one extreme. There was obviously a lot of pushback to this view, and many people who were doing survey work, they said, look, you can actually do a lot of useful things with surveys. They contain a lot of practical information that can be useful not only for policy, but also for thinking about various models. And kind of the gist of the argument they had was that, look, if I see something in survey data which is inconsistent with FIRE, a beautiful theory, then we shouldn't think that the data is wrong. We should think that maybe there is something in the model that needs to be fixing, and we should develop better surveys to test these different theories, or we should try to find elements in these models that are potentially problematic. Now, how much difference it makes, okay, this measurement of surveys? How much deviation do we have from this model consistent benchmark? Now, I wish we knew the true model for the US economy or for any other economy. We have a lot of uncertainty about that. But if we take professional forecasters as an approximation for this full information rational expectations, it is useful to look at what is happening with households, what is happening with firms, what is happening with financial markets. And from this, we can learn something about the nature of inflation expectations and also how we can use them for policy. Now, to this end, let me show you this figure here that plots the time series of average inflation expectations for 4 types of agents. The green line is professional forecasters. So think about this as the full information rational expectations benchmark. The red line is asset prices, and you can see that the green and the red lines, they're kind of following each other very, very closely. So you can think of financial markets and professional forecasters as effectively being the same type of agent in the economy. But then when you look at households, the blue line, or firms, you see very different dynamics, right? So here at the time when inflation was relatively high, or there was, relatively high inflation recently, those different agents had very similar expectations. And then sometime in 2000s, you see this wide divergence of households' inflation expectations from professional forecasters. Okay, so here the difference may be as big as 2, 3, sometimes even 4 percentage points. Now, firms, the black line, they look kind of somewhere in between households and professional forecasters. This is a relatively recent survey of firms in the US. You kind of start at the level that is similar to households, then you kind of go down to professional forecasters. And now again, you see this giant difference between professional forecasters on one hand and firms on the other hand. So kind of firms appear to be somewhere between households and professional forecasters. Anyway, the upshot from this figure is that we shouldn't think that households or firms are behaving according to full information rational expectations. Again, we don't know what that FIRE sin is exactly, but if we take professional forecasters as the benchmark, we see a big departure there in terms of averages. Another thing I want to highlight is how much disagreement you have in expectations. This is a standard deviation of inflation expectations 1 year ahead for professional forecasters. You see there is generally very little disagreement. This is households. So this is 10 times bigger disagreement than disagreement for professional forecasters. And this is a well-documented fact. Again, firms are somewhere in between these 2 extremes. They are not as much in agreement as professional forecasters, but they tend to be more concentrated, less dispersed than households. Now, if you think about full information rational expectations, everybody has the same information. Everybody is rational. So the prediction is that you should have zero disagreement in the economy about future inflation because everybody is sharing the same, idea about the economy, the data generating process, the shocks, the responses of other agents, and so on. So kind of the prima facie evidence here is that if you have so much disagreement here and here, this is not really consistent with full information rational expectations. There has to be something else going on. Maybe there is some of this as measurement noise. Surveys are noisy, but conceivably it's something much more fundamental. Maybe this full information rational expectations is not the right thing. Maybe people have different information sets, so it's not full information, or maybe they're not rational. So that's another challenge for the FIRE framework. Now, another thing I want to highlight in this context is how much uncertainty people have in their forecasts relative to what I call their full information rational expectations benchmark, which is professional forecasters. Now, this red dot is telling us how much probability professional forecasters assign to inflation to be greater than 4 percentage points. Okay, so you have a bunch of people saying that, well, it's somewhere between 0 and 10%. Most of those people will say, as of first quarter 2019, that inflation is not going to exceed 4% next year. And you can see that almost nobody is assigning high probabilities to these scenarios. Okay, so these red dots are very close to zero. In other words, in 2019 first quarter, professional forecasters were saying that inflation practically cannot happen at 4 or above percent. Okay, you look at firms or households, these two bars, and you see there is a significant mass of people predicting inflation will exceed 4 or 5 percentage points. On average, 30% probability that something like this may happen. So on the one hand, you have professional forecasters saying this can happen. On the other hand, you have households and firms saying that it can happen with a very high probability. Okay, so there is much more uncertainty about future inflation. And again, this is striking because, given what was happening over time with inflation in the US over the last 20, 30 years, it's true thinking that, 4% or 5% inflation can happen next year was a very low probability event objectively. But, you look at households and firms, they have much higher probabilities assigned to these scenarios. Okay, so there is something going on there, which is different from FIRE. Now, why is that? Well, in part it's because firms and households have different perceptions of inflation. Okay, so why will we have disagreement about expectations? Well, it's because we have different beliefs about where we are in terms of actual inflation. And this is certainly true not only for households. There is a seminal paper by Michael Weber, Francesco De Conter, and co-authors where they look at the Nielsen survey and they see that there is a ton of disagreement about perceptions of inflation. And a lot of that is coming from the fact that people have different consumption baskets, they have different shopping experiences. And so that could be one reason why you have different inflation expectations through differences in perceptions. But it's not just households, you see the same thing for firms. The actual inflation in 2018 third quarter was just below 3%, and yet you see huge dispersion of perceptions. And this is publicly available information, right? So if you believe in FIRE, everybody should agree that this is the rate of inflation in the economy. You look at the most recent measurement we have for this variable, and you see even bigger dispersion, a lot of disagreement across managers in the US about what exactly inflation rate is. Okay, and by the way, so this question is about a specific price index, CPI. So it's not just, we talk about prices in general. This is for a specific price index. So this is telling us that, again, there is something with perceptions that can, determine this huge variation in uncertainty and also disagreement that is not consistent with full information rational expectations. Now, another way kind of to see problems with kind of current take on FIRE and survey evidence is to follow people over time and see how they revise their beliefs about future inflation. Again, if you take professional forecasters as an assumption that is approaching full information rational expectations, these guys, these agents in the economy have very small revisions in their inflation expectations. It's very unusual when they're going to revise their inflation expectations by more than 1 percentage point. In recent quarters, it's bigger, but historically, over the last 20 to 30 years, it's very unusual for them to have big revisions in their inflation expectations. You look at households, and here you have huge variation. It's not unusual to see somebody revising his or her inflation expectations by 5% down or 5 percentage points up. Firms, again, are somewhere in between, but the gist of this is that you see big revisions in inflation expectations. And it's true not only for short-run inflation expectations, it's also true for long-run inflation expectations. So you have big changes. Now, again, this is not consistent with full information rational expectations because, if everybody has, strong beliefs that the Fed, the central bank in the US, is credible in delivering low and stable inflation, which is, something you should believe if you look at the data over the last 20, 30 years, we should not see these revisions, okay? And yet we see them. Now, another striking thing in the survey data that we have is that there is a very strong correlation between short-term and long-term inflation expectations. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important because in the current context, we hear, well, short-term inflation expectations are high, but that's okay because long-term inflation expectations are much lower. Okay, so they're still anchored. And this makes sense because, we can have business cycle variations and we can deviate from the inflation target in the short run. But if you have a credible inflation target, then what happens today should have very little bearing for how inflation is going to behave in, say, 5 or maybe 10 years. Okay, because, in 10 years, the Fed is going to control inflation and we should expect it's going to be at 2%. So what this means is that we should see a low correlation between short-run and long-run inflation expectations. Now, it's not entirely true in the data. For example, you look at firms or households, there is a very clear, strong correlation. And again, with some oversimplification, if you ask a household, what do you think inflation is going to be next year? This person is going to tell you 5%. You ask this person again, what do you think inflation is going to be in 5 years? This person again is likely to tell you 5%. So it's as if people think inflation is a random walk. It's not consistent with inflation targeting or anything like this. Now you may say that, well, part of the problem here may be that the targets are not credible, and how much people know about the Fed. And the answer there is not very much. In a survey of US managers, we'll ask CEOs to report their perceptions of the Fed's inflation target. Okay, so ask them, what inflation rate do you think the Fed is trying to achieve? And roughly a third of respondents basically said, I don't know. Then another 20+% basically gave us a long spiel about life and death and monetary policy. So it was not really a number that you can make operational. So we call it not usable. And then only roughly 25% of respondents gave us a number that was actually in the range of what we think is consistent with the Fed inflation target. So something reasonably close to 2%. And then you have, again, some variation here. Some people think it's 0, some people think it's 5%. And so it is striking that so few people in the US think that inflation target is is 2%. Okay, and this is not just CEOs. We had a similar survey in a paper with a similar result in a paper with Michael Weber, where we asked households to report their perceptions of the Fed inflation target. And again, you see huge variation. Most people have no idea what the Fed is trying to achieve. Now, one interpretation of this is that the Fed is not credible, and it certainly is a possibility. Another more positive possibility is that people don't care about inflation, and that's why they don't know anything about monetary policy. And in a way, this is a sign of success. Remember, Keynes once famously said that he wants to have economic policy to be as boring as dentistry. When you go to a dentist, you don't really know what they do. You just know it's going to be okay in the end. And so you don't need to know the details of what they do exactly. So maybe we're at this stage too. So certainly a possibility. If you have low and stable inflation for 20, 30 years, people forget about inflation. I'm sure if you ask somebody in Colombia or in my home country, Ukraine, about the inflation target or who is the head of the central bank, these people will give you good answers. So they will know the target, they will know the head, but it's not true in the US. Now, to recap, what I have said so far, this is some predictions of anchored inflation expectations. You look at the data, and none of them is really true in the data. Okay, so inflation expectations don't seem to be anchored. They're not close to the target. You see big revisions, long run and short run inflation expectations are correlated. So all of this is inconsistent with full information rational expectations, at least the way we model them in our models. Now you may say, well, this is just noise. Inflation expectations or any other measures of survey expectations not really doing anything. People just report random numbers, but it's not true. You can look at various pieces of evidence trying to anchor the quality of inflation expectations to incentives of people to pay attention to inflation. And this is from my paper with Oli, Kuavion, and Satan Kumar, where we use New Zealand data. And here you see this clear upward sloping relationship, which is basically saying if you have incentives to pay attention to inflation, you're going to have smaller forecast errors. If you don't have incentives, you're not going to pay attention to inflation. Michael Weber, Francesco, and others have a paper using Finnish data where you try to link the quality of inflation expectations to the IQ of respondents. And again, there is a very striking relationship there. If you have high IQ, you have much better inflation expectations, and you also act on these expectations. So it's not just noise. It's true there is a lot of variation, which is probably random, but it's not noise. It's related to kind of all sorts of frictions and incentives that economic agents face in their lives. Now, using expectations for policy. Okay, so I already mentioned this quote by Mario Draghi, and kind of at the time when we had zero lower bound, and there was a lot of concern that we may have a depressed economy. We want to stimulate the economy by raising inflation expectations. Is this how it's really working in the data? Okay, so it's really a key question. If we raise inflation expectations, this is going to create a boom in the economy, the way it's predicted in our models based on full information rational expectations. And to illustrate how much difference we can have between our models and what happens in reality, I'll use the COVID crisis, but the lessons apply more generally. This is the evolution of professional forecasts in the US during the COVID crisis. You start with this number here, so you expect 2% inflation, a modest growth rate of GDP, and then as the crisis is unfolding, you're moving to the left and down, right? So a big economic contraction that is going to be disinflationary, okay? So people think it's going to be effectively demand shock. You look at households, you start with a high level of expectation, so we know it's already there, it's a big difference. And then you start to go in the right down corner, okay? So you think economy is collapsing and you raise inflation expectations. So people think inflation is stagflationary. You have high unemployment and high inflation at the same time. Two very different takes on what is happening. Okay, same events, presumably the same information sets, but very, very different interpretations. Now, this stagflationary view of the world, you can see it in other ways. This figure here is constructed from the data provided by the Cleveland Fed, where at the daily frequency you ask people about expected inflation and various indicators of, the intensity of the COVID crisis. This red line is, people saying that it's a good time to do saving. And you see a strong correlation between the black line, the expected inflation, and the red line. Whenever you have high inflation expectations, people are thinking they should be saving, not consuming. This is not consistent with our models where inflation expectations going up should create a consumption boom. People should not be saving. So people have a kind of a very dark view of inflation. And you can see this in other indicators, like, you want to stock up on food, you're more concerned about your jobs, you don't want to buy durables. And, this is striking that, in our models, inflation is a good thing. You talk to people and they say, if I have high inflation expectations, I'm not going to be consuming. Actually, I'm going to withdraw from spending. Now, you can also see this in randomized controlled trials. Michael Weber, Oli Corbion, and others have been working on this. And indeed, we find when you exogenously raise inflation expectations, people are much less likely to buy durable goods, which is inconsistent with our models, where through intertemporal substitution, high inflation expectations should result in more frequent purchases of durable goods, higher purchases of non-durable goods. We don't see this in the data. Now you may say, well, this is recent times, and maybe COVID is not representative of what people think on average. But you can take a longer kind of perspective and look at what is happening in say over the last 30, 40 years in the US. And see what is the relationship between expected inflation and economic activity. And for professional forecasters, if we kind of demean the data, take out fixed effects, basically, you see a strong positive relationship. Just saying, if you pick a guy who predicts above average inflation, this person is also going to predict above average growth rate of output. Okay, so it's as if professional forecasters believe there is something like a Phillips curve, which is downward sloping, and also business cycles are driven by demand shocks. Okay, you look at households in the US, this is from the Michigan Survey of Consumers, and you see a very different pattern, a very strong negative relationship. You pick a person who believes inflation is going to be above average, this person is going to predict below average growth rate of output. Now, this is cross-sectional, but you can also look at forecast revisions, basically control for household fixed effects, and you're going to see the same pattern. People think inflation is a very bad state of the world. Now, firms, again, somewhere in the middle, at least in the US, it's not clear there is a clear positive or negative relationship. For some countries, it's going to be positive. For some countries, it's going to be negative. Anyway, so we're in the middle. And again, this is not specific to the US. You can look at other countries. This is from consensus economics, very strong positive relationship between expected inflation and expected growth rate of output for a variety of countries. For households, completely opposite, right? A negative sign saying that more inflation is bad for the economy. And this can explain why now, for example, in the US, despite a very, very strong labor market, so many people are unhappy about the economy. They think, inflation is really terrible thing, and they don't want to spend as much as, they would like to, given their high incomes. Now, where does this leave us? Well, FIRE was a revolution in macroeconomics, and we see it everywhere in policy models and academic research. It's really the dominant framework in macroeconomics. But we also see in survey evidence that there is much difference between what is predicted by these models and what we see in the data. And so I think, the next kind of big item for research agenda in macro is to develop alternatives to FIRE such that we can have still a lot of discipline that is given to us by FIRE, but we have enough flexibility in these models to explain what we see in the survey evidence. Now, the current state of this research agenda is well described with words by Ed Prescott, who said that we have theory ahead of business cycle measurements, that our models are so much better than measurement. We really need to work on measurement. I certainly agree with this statement. We have lots and lots of theories of how people form expectations. Beautiful series, but we need to put more discipline on the series. Okay, and so we need to really build more infrastructure to measure expectations of firms and other agents in the economy to have a better understanding of what is happening on the ground, so we can test the series. And ideally, we need to make this iterations between, okay, we write down the model, we take it to the data, we see if it's passing the tests. If they're not, we go back to the drawing board, have a new set of models, and keep doing this until we converge to some models that are consistent with the micro level evidence from surveys, and also give us, as I said, enough discipline that these models are actually useful for forecasting policy work. Now, speaking of policy work, what do we learn from this advances in measurement and understanding of inflation expectations? First of all, there is a lot of inattention. People are easily distracted in stable macroeconomic environments. They're not going to pay attention to what the central bankers are saying. And so we should understand that, we have maybe 5 minutes of their attention if we want to convey a message to them. We also see lots and lots of rigidities and information frictions. I mentioned this paper where IQ is a strong predictor of the quality of inflation expectations. There is nothing we can do about this, but we should tailor our policies towards, something that is going to be consistent with these frictions, with these rigidities, that we understand that we can't achieve everything. So we have to be in some ways, modest and try to work around these frictions and rigidities. We also see that there is a ton of potential for misinterpretation. People think inflation is stagflationary, even though in the data it's clearly not that. Okay, so we have to deal with this, and we also have huge heterogeneity in beliefs. So when we convey our messages to the general public, we have to tailor our messages depending on who we're talking to. In practical terms, what does it mean? We have to be simple and direct, right? So think about this as writing a Twitter post. It has to be 200 something characters, very simple, lots of pictures, because that's how we can pierce the veil of inattention. It has to be something very concentrated in space and time. We have to provide a holistic perspective. We have to explain what is happening and why we're doing this. And this is important because people have all sorts of theories of what the central banks are trying to achieve. We want to avoid these scenarios. As I mentioned, Keynes was saying we have to have economic policy as boring as dentistry. And so what this means is that, people are not interested in targets. Nobody cares about Fed funds rate because this is not the rate that is faced by households or firms. And so when the Fed talks about Fed funds rate, it has only limited impact on the beliefs of households and firms. And so instead, if the Fed is really trying to manage expectations of the hedges, they should say, okay, our inflation target is 2%. We're going to deliver this. Trust us. Okay. I guess my favorite example of how this works is this famous line from Mario Draghi when he said, we'll do whatever it takes to save the euro. He didn't explain what they will do exactly at the ECB. He just said, look, we have the final result for you. We have the target. The euro is going to be the currency in the European Union. And he didn't go into details about facilities and other instruments they will do to deliver that. We also need to build more infrastructure for measurement. It kind of makes sense. If you want to manage expectations, you have to have a good idea where these expectations are. And it may sound obvious that we need to have something like this, but for example, until very recently, most countries did not have surveys of firms to measure their expectations. We had household surveys, but we didn't have firms for many, many countries. And finally, given the short span of attention for most economic players, households, firms, and so on in the economy, you have to build sustained information campaigns. What we see in experimental evidence is that within 3-6 months, people forget what you tell them about monetary policy. And so if you want to have their attention, if you really want to influence their behavior, you have to repeat the same message over and over and over again. We often say in academia that repetition is the mother of learning. And so if you invite me to give another talk in Colombia, I'll probably come back and give you something similar. Let me stop here and thank you for your attention.
Thank you really for an amazing presentation. I think it was very enlightening for everybody here. I'm very concerned. I don't know, we should, unless we can educate everybody to be macroeconomists, we're in trouble. So, so it looks like we have to do both. Maybe try to make everyone a forecaster or work on our models, but it looks like a daunting task, but very interesting. So thank you. So I want to open up the floor for questions. But you know, again, fantastic presentation. I think for everybody here was like nodding and saying and laughing, and yeah, this is very, very positive and very interesting. So yeah, so we're gonna pass the mic around and ask questions, please.
Yeah, very interesting talk, Yuri. So like, I was wondering whether you can maybe speculate a little bit on what you think actually now might actually change or have changed over the last 12 months with inflation in many countries having picked up again. Do you think like, you know, inattention has decreased, forecasts that were smaller, reaction to news different, people acquiring more information? So like, you know, just curious to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you. I will speculate mostly. So one thing which is striking now is that, you know, if you go back to say 2020 or 2019 and see how many headlines were about inflation or expected inflation, and it was basically nothing. You know, New York Times would not have any, you know, discussion of inflation or inflation expectations. Now there is an explosion. And the reason why it's important is because here in this talk, I was mostly emphasizing that, you know, there is demand for inflation and people decide for themselves how much attention they want to allocate to inflation or other things in their lives. But one thing which is missing from this picture is the supply of information. And so the fact that we have so much supply now is not only lowering the cost of acquiring and processing information, it is also a window of opportunity, so to say, to change inflation expectations. You know, most of my talk, I was complaining about how little attention people allocate to monetary policy, and so it's going to be really hard to manage inflation expectations. Now, when everybody is paying attention to inflation and monetary policy, this is a golden opportunity for Jay Powell and other central bankers to communicate with the public and grab their attention and explain, you know, what inflation target is numerically and practically. So there are some upsides to what we see today.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is really fascinating. I have a naive question for you on aggregation. So you've shown us a lot of facts about households and firms' expectations, how they vary, etc. I mean, how should we think about it for the aggregate? Because another aspect of the fire is that people have mostly, you know, kind of ignored these issues for long, like aggregation issues, and now they come to the fore. So how should we think about that?
Well, it's true if you ask any single household what inflation is going to be, and this person gives you a number, this is not going to be a very good forecast for inflation. But what is striking is that if you take an average across you know, various people, various firms, this averages consensus forecasts from household surveys or firm surveys are, you know, surprisingly precise. For example, if you look at the forecast errors for this year or for the previous year, households and firms on average, you know, if you look at their consensus forecasts, give you a much better prediction than professional forecasters. So there is some wisdom in this crowd, even though we have this enormous heterogeneity in beliefs. Somehow, when you take an average, it looks a lot more reasonable than you would think otherwise.
Yeah, so you're a great presentation. That was awesome. Just to follow up on this point about like, so now everybody has information about inflation. So in a sense, also something else that I know you guys have studied around, for instance, the Trump and Biden administration starts is that people seem to have beliefs that vary dramatically with the kind of partisanship, expectations about what will happen in the economy and so on and so forth. So, I mean, in a sense, one view is that finally, as you were suggesting, people understand what inflation is. It could be the great transfer power in others to educate them. At the same time, it seems actually it's maybe exactly the time when all these kind of narratives, political specific views might be ingrained into people and stay in their mind probably forever because they start to think about it a bit more, whereas before they couldn't care less about inflation. So I don't know what you think based on your work of you guys on this point.
Thank you, Francesco. I think narratives are extremely important, and you can see this in the daily life in the US. For example, you go to some gas stations in California, and some of them will have stickers saying it's Biden price hike. Okay, you go to some other gas stations in California, and they will see Putin's price hike. Okay, so who is politically responsible for this is obviously a big deal, and it gives very different narratives about the nature of inflation. Is it coming from fiscal stimulus, being kind of overdoing the support of the economy, or this is coming from energy prices, which comes from the Russian invasion of Ukraine? So this is very important. But again, this is a window of opportunity for us to look at all these different narratives and provide, something which is credible with the general public. I should also very briefly mention, I know I'm out of time, that when you look at inflation expectations of households just before elections, it was striking when you ask people counterfactual questions. Like, if you're a Trump supporter and you say, suppose Biden is going to win, what do you think inflation is going to be? And then this person is going to give you an astronomically high inflation expectation. Okay, so it's as if Biden is going to create the end of the world kind of scenario. Now you ask a Biden supporter, what do you think if Trump is going to win? You see exactly the same thing. They say, well, if Trump is going to win, we're going to have a hyperinflation. Now, obviously, none of this has happened, but it is striking how much this political, element is clouding inflation expectations. And again, this is not consistent with full information rational expectations. We're not going to have hyperinflation in the US anytime soon. No matter who is the president, we're not going to have a 10,000% inflation or 1,000,000% inflation. Thank you.
Hi, Yuri. It's Michael McMahon here. Quick question on your sort of policy lessons. As you know, I'm a big fan of the idea of central banks targeting their communication. But do you think there are risks that come from trying to talk to the wider, audience? I mean, it used to be simple, right? You only had to talk to bond traders, and they learned the language, and then, Greenspan had his little ready reckoner of words he could use to give hints, and everything seemed to work, and nobody paid attention. Now we're trying to engage everyone, and it's really striking. If you log onto the ECB's website now, the headline message is actually about climate change and the ECB's engagement with the issue. I think it's great, and it clearly engages young people, but we now have inflation again, and not within our targets. So I think, do you think there are risks, and what can central banks do about those?
Thank you, Michael. I would say two cents. Many years ago, you were at the conference in Ukraine about the central bank communication, and you made this comment about why so few people pay attention to monetary policy. And this was something to the effect like, if I can have a movie about black holes and get people excited as black holes, we should be able to do something similar to excite people about monetary policy and inflation. Now, one lesson I got from that comment was that, we economists are not trained in public speaking and communicating with the general public. And so what this means is that we should, if we believe in the division of labor, we should hire professionals to manage these PR campaigns. My favorite example is, a set of short movies created by the Cleveland Fed, where they use Lego characters to explain how inflation works, how the Fed is controlling inflation. And I thought this would be, a terrific exercise in explaining what happens with inflation. I agree with you that, you go to the websites of, major central banks, the ECB, the Fed, and so on. And in many ways, it's very cryptic. People don't get the right messages, I would say. It should be something a little bit more positive, a little bit more accessible. So there is still some work to do there. Thank you.
It seems that we don't have any more questions in the audience. I wanted to thank you again for taking the time. I hope again that we can have you here at some point in Colombia. But this has been really enlightening and fascinating, and I think it gives us a lot to think about now that we have high inflation here in Colombia. That there's a lot of talk on how to control inflation expectations, if monetary policy actually works. We start second guessing everything that we think we know, and I think you gave us fantastic reasons to actually second guess how we do stuff. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
I hope everything at home gets well.
Thank you so much.